This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
We want an easy answer, and it can be a complex answer. What I mean by easy is that there are definable steps. We want an answer to life's societal problems that we can line up and say, first you do this, and then second you do this. Something preferably that's measurable, that we can, use assessment to evaluate the quality of these steps, right? And improve. Yeah, I know, right? For higher education. Yeah, it's very familiar. This is the kind of thing that we want. This is what we're used to. But if the thesis of my book is correct, and our society has imbibed a false anthropology, that the structures, practices, intuitions, values, aesthetics, attitudes, language that we use is based on the premise that we are fundamentally our own and we belong to ourselves. If that's the case, then the problem is diffuse. It's deeply ingrained. And while I would like to tell people, here's the mindset change that will set you free. Right. This is what people want to hear. Like, you just need to have a aggressive mindset or something, like a growth mindset or something. And, I'm not my own mindset, and then everything's going to get better. And, I do think if you begin to practice and understand and internalize the fact that you belong to God, and therefore in an analogous way, you belong to your family and to creation, to the church and to your neighbors, I do think that it does bring comfort. It does. It does bring comfort, but it's not going to solve all the problems. And there are going to be forces in society that still pressure you to be someone and a certain kind of understanding of what being someone is, to have certain values, to achieve certain things. And that's not going to go away anytime soon. And I don't know of anyone who has. I've never heard a good solution to that on the societal level. So that makes it difficult to write this kind of book, because the diagnosing is much easier than the solution.
Yeah, it also makes it very difficult to merchandise based on this, because I could imagine hats, pens, toys.
Oh, there could be a movement.
Yeah,
The Yano, you are not your own.
The Zim Zoom of you are not your own. Or
That's right. It could be.
Not to indict anybody.
Yeah, it's not sexy. It's not. It doesn't got a nice ring to it.
That impulse that you're describing there, it is almost like somebody who's been in dysfunctional relationships for years and years coming into a counselor saying, what do you hope to achieve through this counseling? Like, oh, I just want to be fixed by, can we do that this session or next session? Or like, what do you think? What's the timeline here? It's like you didn't get into this hole quickly, and you're not going to come out quickly.
That's right.
And something you said there, though, is intensely interesting to me, is that you said to practice and internalize this. So why not just meditate on it, if I can use that sentiment? How do you practice knowing that you're not your own?
Yeah. It's not pleasant. It's not easy. So this is a great.
You're selling it here.
I'm really selling this book, aren't I?
Yeah, I love it.
So I don't give you all the easy answers. There's no 5-step plan to saving America or the Western society or whatever. And also, so my goal is, sometimes I get asked, what's the goal of this book? And it's really twofold. One is that there's this inhuman burden that we placed on our shoulders, society's placed on our shoulders. It's both of us together. What I call the responsibilities of self-belonging. If we belong to ourselves, there are sort of natural implications that are, I argue, inhuman, that we just cannot bear them, and we suffer as a consequence of that. So the first goal of the book is to lift that off, to help people see that's a lie. That's nonsense. It's not true. It's not biblically true. It's not factually true. You don't have to craft your own identity and become, someone in order to have a validated life, et cetera, which is very freeing if we take that seriously. But the second half is, well, if we don't belong to ourselves, then we belong to God, and we have burdens and obligations to others, we don't get to do what we want. Like there are going to be things that we deeply desire that we're going to have to say no to. And that answers your question, right? That's how we practice belonging to God, is that I have a son who's 9 years old and does not enjoy going to church. Nothing against my pastor. He just he's a 9-year-old little boy. He wants to run around. It's Sunday morning. He wants to run around. And frankly, there are many Sunday mornings where I just want to sit around and read. And there have been times where I've gotten up and been like, man, we are so exhausted. Maybe we should just stay home this Sunday. And my son will immediately start complaining about church, and I realize, no, I have to set aside my desires and practice belonging to God, because my son is watching me and he needs to see that it's not about what dad feels like. We don't go to church when dad feels like it, when it's comfortable, when it's easy. We do it because we belong to a community, and I need to be around, the other church members so I can see their needs and pray for them and sing with them and all these sorts of things. So, it's in one sense, it's an easy question to answer. How do we internalize? Well, we practice dying to self and choosing the good of others. But it's in another sense, it's almost an impossible question to answer, because there are innumerable possible, opportunities, which is, made that section of the book difficult to write too. Because I'm like, just all of the things.
Yeah. Well, and that's the longest section of the book is how we belong to Christ, right? And then you have the addendum, and here's why I'm not going to tell you exactly what to do. But you do, and part of it is, I think of 1 Corinthians, where this is the problem, is unity, that they belong to each other. And Paul has to keep hitting them. He has to hit them along the contours of their particular sins, right? Sleeping with the stepmom, getting drunk on the communion wine, outbreaks of charismatic fervor that seem to be unrestrained. But he keeps on returning to this theme of unity, and the phrase that I've come up to, the kind of caricature what he says there, is kind of take the loss. Like, even if somebody's suing you, make it right on the way before you have to go to the judge. Just take the loss, whatever it is, just take the loss for the sake of unity. Yeah. And I wonder if that's that mentality can get parochial and specific in a way of showing that you belong to people. Is like, are you willing to lose the fight, take the loss, be humiliated, stop doing something you really, really want to do? Does that follow along with what you're saying?
Absolutely. And I really tried to convey this in the book, which again might not have been a bad idea for sales, but that what I'm talking about is not, it's just not so the example I gave is like going to church on Sunday when you don't want to go, right? So that's a minor inconvenience. But like you were saying, taking the loss, sometimes that's a real loss. Sometimes that means sacrificing a career, saying, I'm going to stay in this place. I could have this opportunity over here, but I'm committed to this place because I know that I'm serving these people in this capacity, and this is good, and this is where I need to be. And it's a loss, and you will possibly be criticized for making that choice. In marriage, it doesn't matter who you meet. It doesn't matter how wonderful, beautiful, interesting they are. It doesn't matter how much they like you. When you're married, that's it. You're married. And you don't get to pursue other happiness that you imagine to be out there. These are real sacrifices that are not easy, and that what I think is so important is that we have sources outside of us saying, you need to pursue your happiness, because nobody else is going to do it for you. If you're going to be happy with that person, then you need to do that. You need to actualize that, because it's not going to just happen. If you're going to be happy in that career, you got to leave your family and your community that raised you and your church and follow your heart and go there. Without concern for other obligations, and so this demands a lot. But what I try to say is that the burdens of the responsibilities of self-belonging are unbearable. They are inhuman in nature. Whereas I want to say that the burdens of belonging to others are on a human scale. They're difficult. Real dying to self is involved here, but with the Holy Spirit's help, you can do these things, and that I think is makes all the difference in the world.
So I think of a couple. We're interested in pursuing the biblical thinking from this podcast on this, and I think of a couple spots. Well, maybe I can just ask you the big question. I know you're not like a professional theologian, but play one. You can play one on this podcast. Do you see any ways in which God belongs to us? And I mean it in the reciprocal way, not that God is possessed by us, but that he sees himself in a similar way as like he's constrained in what he can do, and that he limits himself with reference to us for the sake of communion with us.
I mean, so if you enter into a covenant with people, there is, or at least the kind of covenant that we have with God, then I think there are sets of, he has agreed to do certain things for us, and he will follow that. He will follow through with that. But, yeah, that's a great question though. Aside from that, the idea of covenant, I would say,
Well, even covenant though, as soon as God is agreeing, like I point out to my students with Noah, as soon as he says, I'll never do this again, at this point, it is incoherent to say God can do whatever he wants. And all consequences be damned, at least. You'd say, well, no, if he does something other than what he's promised to do at that point, then he's not true to what his promise and becomes a specious creature like us.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been thinking. So the concept of belonging. Okay, all right. Here's the answer. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I think where we turn is union with Christ. So one way of understanding belonging is a desire for a kind of union with someone. So in marriage, there's a belonging to each other. Not all belongings are the same. Not all unions are the same. But when you have I was meditating on the relation of parents to children, why that could be a particularly painful one. And I think one of the reasons is that as a parent, when the child is young, you feel that union. You feel connected to them. You feel what they feel. You hurt for them. You rejoice with them. And then naturally, they actually grow apart. It's so one of the few relationships where inherently, by design, there's actually and there's still a connection. There's still a belonging, but it's, you separate. So if that's the case, if all kinds of belonging involve a kind of union in some respect, and then certainly, we're in union with Christ, and that's what that looks like there, and it is reciprocal.
Interesting that with Christ, the metaphors are, or the analogies, I should say, are with bride and bridegroom. So with children, there is this kind of leave and cleave metaphor, but with Christ, it's grow together into the relationship. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, I was also thinking that the Christ hymn in Philippians, if that's a sort of take the loss for the sake of, Jesus who being equal, the mind of Christ who being equal to God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped onto, right? In Genesis 2, specifically Genesis 2, when God makes man, and even in Genesis 1, the man is actually, there's a Hebrew word for man, ish, and woman, isha, but that's not the word that's being used throughout Genesis 1 and 2. It's actually ha'adam, because he was taken from ha'adamah, the dirt, right? So I call him the dirtling, or the dustling, or the soiling, or the earthling, whatever you want to call him.
Yeah.
But he's and it's specifically noted, and it's not just that he is the dirtling, but it's noted several times. For you were taken from the dirt. Yeah. To dust you shall return. From dust you were taken. And the woman is noted as being taken from the man, for you were taken from the man. So there's always this stated relationship of where things were taken from. And I've always kind of pictured that as setting up humanity. And by the way, animals are also dirtlings taken from the dirt with the breath of life in them, given to them by God, but they're somehow different from him and the woman, and that's the puzzle of Genesis 2. But for me, I've always seen that as like your ontological, the nature of human existence itself is already that it came from somewhere and things belong to each other.
Good.
So that there isn't autonomous man. And when God looks at man alone, he says, no bueno, right? This is not good. And puts them in a belonging relationship. And in fact, that fit mate or fit helper or strong ally, as one of my friends has taught me to say. So I'm wondering does that play out in the trajectory, that we therefore, like the very nature of what it means to be a human is to belong to something? Yeah.
So I am not a philosopher, and I didn't want to get outside my wheelhouse. Do you know what a wheelhouse is? I just had to learn this.
In a boat, right?
Yeah. Okay. I didn't know that. I always pictured.
I assume that's what it was.
I don't know. Yeah, that it's like where the wheel goes in a car. I didn't know.
The wheel housing, not to be confused with the wheel housing. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. In any case, one of the things I try to do with this book is try to go a step beyond the conversation about individualism in America, which is part of what I'm talking about. Yeah. And I do want to talk about this in some sense in either existential or you could say ontological terms, right? This idea that to be a human, being a human involves belonging. It inherently always involves belonging. And to others. And so to answer your question, yes, I mean, that makes total sense to me. Right. So, we come from creation, which came from, or the earth, which came from God. Right. And he breathed into us. Right. So there's always this before, this story, this community, this embodiment before us that we are indebted to and that we carry along with us, and we're responsible for carrying to future generations. So that's part of what the argument I'm trying to make is that don't just think about ourselves as not being individuals, right? Or, getting away from individualism, American individualism, right. But just more ontologically, to be in the world means to belong to someone else.
And I mean, also humans always belong to their mothers, if not their father. They belong to their mothers and fathers biologically. Their mothers. I don't know if the mothers have the advantage of having that 9-month belonging or the disadvantage. We'd have to take a poll, I think. And I think a lot of what you're doing in this book, it seems to be, if I can say it crassly, you're stating what should be obvious to all of us. You use a lot of. I was a little surprised when I was reading through it. A lot of Jacques Ellul shows up there, and I wonder why Ellul is so prominent in your thinking. I mean,
this is one of the best parts about. I don't know if I want to call myself a scholar, but reading, is that sometimes you just stumble across a book and it just changes your perspective, and usually it's not something where they're usually explaining something you've already intuitively felt or seen little glimpses of, and then all of a sudden they put language to it and an explanation and a system, and you're like, oh my gosh, and this whole vista just opens up to you. And that was Jacques Ellul. I don't remember, I just, who recommended it. I saw several people who I respect deeply, talking about Ellul and the Technological Society. And so I read that while sort of researching for this book. And when I came across his concept of technique, and I thought about the way these things overlapped, it was just it felt like a missing piece that explained a lot.
Yeah, I think he's very well used in the biblical studies as well. I think a lot of people stumble onto them and say, I have to say though, your book is like that for me too. A lot of these things I feel like I had threads into, and then you put the threads together into this beautiful sweater, which I could put on and enjoy. So this is, you did that for me, which I genuinely appreciate. Actually, Selena Durgan, our director of operations and editor, she had a question for you, if I can pose it correctly. I'm not going to read it because she wrote 3 paragraphs to get to one question, because that's how Selena is. But she is wondering this kind of middle way that you're selling, this idea of not merely resignation as a practice, but that there's this way that resigning from something is affirming something else. That there's no kind of like there's no neutral acts. And her question was a little bit strange. It was, why isn't this obvious to everybody? Like, why isn't like what has happened?
That's a great
that Christians are not like, because I do feel like if I put that to my grandmother, she would be like, well, yeah, I wouldn't have said it that way, but of course, right? This is how Christians are supposed to live. So, what has happened that hasn't been obvious to Christians who are trying to live out, who are trying to belong to the empire of God properly?
Yeah, so if I understand it, is this referring to the idea of sometimes they call it action and stillness? I'm getting it really from T.S. Eliot and from Ellul, right? This idea that when we're in the city, God is calling us to be in the city, which for Ellul is really just the post-Enlightenment world, really, for the most part. Any industrialized country, when we're in the city and we're called to be there, our goal is not to come up with a plan to transform the city in some intricate, well-intentioned, but probably harmful way, but to display God in the city where we are, with hope and knowledge that if God can make all of Nineveh repent, He can also make our cities repent, which is a difficult tension to have, because we either want to say, I have the plan and I just need to execute it. And if I can't execute it, it's either because I have a poor will, or because I'm not getting enough support or funding, or because those people are evil or whatever. And it seems like Ellul's saying that's not, unless God is coming down and giving you the plan, you need to be faithful where you are. But you don't get to despair. You don't get to say, well, America's going down the tubes. There's nothing we can do. No, and that's tough, because we have to pursue justice without imagining that we're saving the world. Yeah. Is that the...
That's part of it. And I think that was actually, you're stumbling onto a question I had as well, which is you talk about later in the book, the way I've heard it said is, a drop can't change the direction of the river, right? Maybe I need to do this thing. Or I think of Shifra and Puah in Exodus 1, who they're just 2 midwives working for the Hebrews. And little did they know, their actions and the actions of the other women in those stories were going to change the direction of Egypt. But that wasn't like a plan, like, hey, let's putting a strategy together. If we save these boys, then one of them might murder some dude someday, and then go on the run, and then come back with the power of God, right?
I imagine they were in youth group, and their youth pastor was like, each of you can go out and change the world. And they're like, that's why we're going to do it.
Right.
We're going to do this to change the world. No, that's exactly right. Yeah.
This is one of my favorites, Stephen Wright. Do you know Stephen Wright, the comedian? Do you ever remember him?
I don't know.
He was a famous one-liner comedian from the 80s, but he said, I used to watch those commercials with Smokey the Bear that says, only you can prevent forest fires. And he goes, I'd always look at those when I was a kid and go, me? Like, I'm the only one who can prevent forest fires? Like, I better get to work.
That's right.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of our students have that pressure.
Oh, yeah.
Right. They've been told that repeatedly. And then they're just like, they're carrying, again, this responsibility of self-belonging. Yeah. So maybe that question then was about this phrase I think I included in the book that that we are called to renunciation in affirmation, not resignation.
Yep. That was exactly it. I was just was the part that I was going to read next. So.
Yeah. So I've thought about this quite a bit. I'm getting this a bit from Eliot. Why is it not intuitive? It's really hard. So here's where I first realized this myself was I wrote an essay about the nature of lust and desire. And exploring the fact that for many young men that I know, it's difficult to see a beautiful woman and not react in a couple of ways. One is this desire to possess, and another is a kind of bitterness or resentment because they can't possess this person. And in this article, I argue that the proper posture is a posture of thanking God for the beauty of others and thanking God that that beauty is not ours to participate in intimately. And this is true for all kinds of things, right? Like somebody has a job that you desire, or somebody has a car or a house or whatever it might be, because I do think that it's difficult for us to see things that we know are good. We could see that and say, that's objectively good. That's beautiful. That person's interesting. Why can't I be with them? But if we have faith in the providence of God, and we have, and if we accept that we belong to God and therefore this life is not the only thing that matters. So we don't have to have the fear of missing out, right? Like if I'm not with the right person, then my life is pointless. Then what we can do is we can see something good over there and we can be thankful that it's over there and that it's not ours. We can thank God for his beauty. And so that's where I kind of settled on this idea that a lot of the Christian life involves renouncing things that you maybe desire, and they can be good things if you're a different person in a different position, but they're good things. So you renounce it and you say, I that's not mine to desire or to pursue or whatever, but you're renouncing it in a spirit of affirmation. It's good that thing exists. It's good that this person is beautiful and interesting. Not resignation, because the temptation is to be like, and I'm bitter because I don't have this, or I don't want anyone else to have this, or why are they attractive? That makes me mad. Why is this not intuitive? Why is this difficult for Christians? Well, I probably this is such a reformed cop out, but sin. It's so much easier for us to cling to envy.
Reformed and Wesleyan people at one point, this was the center of their theology. I got books of Puritan prayers here that are all like every single one of them is renouncing something, right? Yeah. So like liturgically, what do you think we've lost in our 21st century situation we find ourselves in, where renunciation it's like people are almost like, it's almost like ascetic, like, oh wow, you renounce something that you could have had easily but wouldn't be right for you. Wow, how brave!
Right? No, that's right. And this reminds me of the line from Ellul that what I end up talking about, which is something along the lines of, "We must choose not to do all that we can do." Right, and that's kind of one of his ethics of technology, right? When because you can do something, we must actually make an intentional effort not to do certain things. And you're right, that is foreign. We look at that like, what's going on? Maybe this is too simplistic, but I would just say, if we have an entire economy built on making people feel discontent and inadequate and envious, and then assuring them that they have the right and ought to pursue whatever they can get by any means, then it's pretty hard, even in the church, for people to come to normalize the idea of self-denial, of renunciation.
Just in you saying that, it made me think of issues I see sometimes with earnest Christians saying things like, well, where in the Bible does it say, which is my favorite question, that begins with, doesn't it say in the Bible somewhere that, or where does it say that I can't do this thing? Like, and it reduces it all to this dysfunctional legalism. Cause I think there's a functional version of legalism that can be, save us from some errors. But really this, and I see it also in other ways with people that have this kind of idea that God has a singular will for me and I have to do that thing. Gosh. And if I don't, then I'm not. And these all, as I was reading you, seem to be in some way, and I couldn't quite connect the dots, but seem to be symptomatic of me being the autonomous person that has pure agency here, and their false anxieties and desires. And So the idea that I can do all of these things, but I choose not to. I mean, I just think like, okay, marital counseling, like if you can't get this down as a young adult, like you're dragging a lot of bad stuff into a marriage, right?
That's right. That's right. So yeah, those are two interesting observations. This idea of singular calling, right? So there's this idea that God has a map for your life, timeline for your life, and that you can know that, right? And that he's going to give it to you, and that if you don't follow it, then you're going to be in sin, right? So there's that idea, which seems sort of the opposite of freedom, but I'll explain, I think, a way of understanding that in a minute. But then there's this other idea where Christians can say, really, all things are available to me. I can have any career. If there's a career, I can have it with very few exceptions, right? So that, organized crime, prostitution, right? There are some things where we'll say, okay, you can't work in pornography, okay. But a lot of other things, the assumption is give grace, assume that it's perfectly legitimate and that a Christian can work or should work in that. And even I feel like sometimes there's this, it'd be very uncomfortable for you to say, I think this field, this market is actually, at least for the most part, disordered and sinful, and I don't think Christians should participate in that. I feel like my evangelical genes just get anxious just hearing myself say that, right? Like there's just we have absolute freedom, right? So the freedom one, that's easy to see, right? If you are your own, then we want that kind of expansive options. But, the calling one is a sense of security, right? Because we want to know that our lives are meaningful and purposeful. And when the horizon has been wiped away and it's just this blank slate and we don't know where we're supposed to go or what we're supposed to do or who we're supposed to be, there's tons of feelings of inadequacy and anxiety. And so an idea, and I don't think it's a healthy idea, but an idea of Christian calling where you feel like, well, I'm just going to figure out God's calling me to do this specific thing, and I just have to follow these steps. And now I'm living in His will, so I can feel okay with myself. That it's kind of security until okay, you start off and you feel like I was called to ministry. This is it. This is my one thing. I'm going to do this, and then you start taking a Hebrew class, and you realize I can't do languages at all, right? Or whatever, and then you have this not an educational crisis. What major should I choose? This is clearly not where I'm gifted. Instead, it's an existential crisis. I'm in sin, right? I'm in defiance of God's will for my life. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I've seen students walk through this, and it's painful. And what I tried to argue in the book, I think, or at least when I give talks, I can't remember what I wrote in the book. It was a long time ago, to be honest.
I understand.
That we have a lot of good things that we can do, and this is an exciting thing. And what we have to be able to accept that God gives us good opportunities, and we just need to pursue one of those in gratitude and in faithfulness. And if that doesn't work out, we can do something else. Now that mindset doesn't work if you are your own, because you can't afford mistakes. Like every mistake puts you behind and other people are getting ahead of you. But if we're not our own, if the point of our life is to worship God, then you can try something and maybe for a season that's what's honoring to God and that's what you need to do, and you can do something else later, and that's okay.
Yeah.
There's not this one thing that's going to make your life meaningful.
Yeah, and I think just hearing biographies of people, I think we often realize, I mean, when people ask you, how'd you get into biblical studies? I'm like, well, it's a funny story. I stumbled backwards about 7 different ways. It was a zigzag, but not a straight line. And man, I can't even imagine the pressure I would have felt if I thought that there was this thing that I was supposed to be doing along the way.
Right.
I've already decided that I am reading this book at the table with my high schooler, and I'm going to try and get my students to listen to you or read your stuff for extra credit. So
there you go. Thanks.
I mean, this is what they need. I say it to them all the time, but just having somebody else say it and more coherently, it's amazing. It's like being a parent,
Yeah.
You want other adults in your kid's life saying the same things.
That's true.
Like how many times my students are like, come into my office and I'm like, well, here's what I think. And they're like, that's what my dad said. And I'm like, well, maybe you should listen.
There you go.
Maybe your dad's not an idiot.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
Yeah. Because it was written, I mean, I didn't intend to write this for students, but working with students every day, that is the lens that came through, and I think it can be particularly helpful. I hope it is for them. So
you go bold in the kind of the opening chapter or second chapter of this book, where you say, like, let's imagine a woman who has children and might want to stay home, or a parent who wants to stay home, and all the things that are going to be, all the pressures she's going to feel not to do that. What are you insinuating that being a stay-at-home parent is, well, how is that a renunciation, I guess, and how is that a show of belonging?
To be a stay-at-home parent?
Yeah.
Well, I think I try to make the claim that it's not, that it doesn't need to be normative, like people don't necessarily need to do that. But, staying at home with your kids provides you all kinds of space to be hospitable, to care for your house, to care for your neighbor. Think about, how much, So, all right. So the backstory is this is the story of my wife, and she has 2 master's degrees, one in math and one in economics from Baylor, and we move out here. She works at OBU for a year, then she stays home and tries homeschooling. And we had 3 young kids at the time. Now, just one's 12, so it's a little bit easier, but. There was a number of things that were really frustrating. One is it seemed intuitive to me that at least choosing the options to stay at home can be a good thing, right? Choosing to say, I'm going to invest, as I think I say in the book, is one of the most human things you can do to care for your children in this way, right? There's lots of ways to do it, but this is one way, and it's a very beautiful thing. But just all the forces that made it, so for my wife, it was renouncing career opportunities, right? She was saying, all right, I'm not going to pursue, data analysis. Instead, I'm going to stay home with my kids. But, in that I tried to explore the way that, while that's laudable in practice, society makes it miserable.
Mm. Yeah. And even as you pointed out, the little ways in which just going to a party and everybody saying, what do you do? There's no socially acceptable answer in some circles if you're a stay-at-home parent.
Even among conservatives, because they can be like, in one sense, they're like, oh, yeah, that's great. They're really supportive. But in another sense, they're like, okay, but I have nothing to say to you. So it's like, okay.
What are we going to talk about? Yeah, I think also when this comes up, typically it's the mom who stays at home. Not always, but
yeah.
I always think too that it shouldn't just be the mom that is renouncing. It, like the dad or whoever works should also be renouncing opportunities as well, cutting back on hours, making priority for the family. It should be a mutual renunciation, I think, in an ideal situation. Absolutely. And that's hard. That's all kinds of different pressures, but the same fundamental pressure. And I think economically too, thinking of my majority world friends, like sometimes it's just not fiscally possible. Even in the Northeast here, sometimes just to live in the smallest place possible is going to require 2 people working, depending on the level of education and pay. So it's not always possible. But finally, I want to go back to this legalism issue. How you can imagine people who are just like, just tell me what to do, just tell me the rule to follow, which is the pressure you got at the end of the book. Mm-hmm. But is that in and of itself, that pressure, is that an expression of the very problem that you're trying to diagnose? Yeah, I think I try, or at least I thought about it, to make the argument that itself is a desire for a technique, right? We want a technique to fix the problem that a society obsessed with techniques has created. And so what's a non-technique answer? Well, I think a non-technique answer is not assuming that you have the most efficient way to solve things, but choosing still to do good, whether it's the most efficient. Right? And I think
this conversation is, I think, really important when it comes to, justice issues, which are, on the minds of our students and everyone, most people right now, because, people can make arguments about, well, this is the most efficient way or the effective way. Like, this is a means, this is a data-proven way of fixing this racial problem. And sometimes we just have to do things because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
And it might not, like, long-term fix things, and that's okay. That's all right. But that's a different kind of perspective.
Is that so that is not identical to don't let the perfect, get in the way of the good or something like that, but it is inclusive. Have you heard this phrase before?
Yeah. I would say it's inclusive of it. Yeah. Except that saying can also just turn into technique, right? So what you could do is you could just say, all right, yeah, so the perfect is actually inefficient, right? Shooting for the perfect, it's never going to happen. So what we have to do is lower our standards and figure out so maybe in some cases, like actually having that more perfect standard might actually be what we need to do because maybe we can't accomplish it, but it's the most human way to treat each other.
So what you do ultimately is you make room for the idea of stumbling around as a Christian community a little bit more than I think most people are comfortable with. This has come up several times in different conversations in various ways. So we've had a whole series on repentance where we talked to Congolese war survivors and Rachel Denhollander and others.
Yeah.
And really thinking even about the idea of grace and forgiveness in Christian community, that if the ideal is that you have this deep heart penitence and everybody has a come to Jesus moment, but if you're held hostage to that view of it has to be that or nothing else, that, like a cliff system of forgiveness, then you can't make room for what the biblical authors seem to envision as well, which is like, hey, you need to be able to live in the same village without anybody like killing somebody else for the wrong they committed to their family, right? like you just have to be able to let something slide with some processes in place, right?
Right.
And so I wonder, and to me, that just is another expression of because we belong to each other and we belong to God in a particular way. And so you tell me if I'm overstepping your thesis here. We need to have these different degrees in which we can mediate our belonging to each other and mediate, like, we're not going to kill this person. We're not going to throw them in jail because we don't have accommodations for jail in the scripture. We just need to find some way in which we can occupy the same space and not kill each other.
Right. No, I think that's true. And where I think that's particularly relevant is, I don't know if we want to call it a post-secular world. It's a very contested term, but
we know what you mean by that. Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever the tensions we're experiencing and continue, and they're probably only going to increase. Right. And this is one of the reasons I love Ellul when he talks about, in his book, The Meaning of the City, speaking of his scriptural biblical studies, his work is, he describes sort of the norm as being in exile and still, and not, and getting along with your neighbors and seeking to have peace with them without expecting the whole system to change. Which I don't think is entirely as satisfying as we want, but I think it's realistic and I think it's good. I'm not sure if that quite gets to what you were talking about. This idea, are you talking about grace for each other, or is there a particular part of the book you had in mind, or?
No, it was a theme of I call it stumbling around, right? That there's this way in which we're not going to get the answers this side of the return. Okay. And so there's some way in which stumbling around actually puts hope in the final reconciliation. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I think that is exactly right. I do, and one way I address this is the idea of, what I negatively describe as coping mechanisms. Yeah. And this came out of my first book when, which I write about a lot about distractions. And then I, went around talking to people about it, and they wanted to be like, well, so what is your great aesthetic life, right? Where you're just, and I was like, I also watch sitcoms and I have a phone. And so I started to sort of interrogate myself and look at other people. And the conclusion I came to is that in my initial book, I made too strong of a claim about the reasons why we're distracted. And so some of the reason is because we don't want to look at ourselves, but it seems to me also because we live in a world that is deeply inhuman, and sometimes we need to get through the day. And so one of the ways I try to allow people to stumble around is that I recognize, some people that means, watching a football game. And that is a way of now, and in the book, and this was one of the hardest things. It's such a fine line, and I don't know if I threaded it correctly. You thread the line.
Yeah.
Speaking of mixed metaphors,
welcome to
is that a baseball metaphor?
Yes, my malapropisms have infected you.
Yeah. That's right. Would it be better to watch a football game for 3 hours or 4 hours or whatever, or, read Shakespeare or read the Bible or something, right? And there's always this sense, and we can guilt ourselves as feeling like I've got to make efficient use of our time. And one of the places where I try to argue is that, this is just going to be tough. Like this, living in this society is going to be very difficult, and we need to have grace for each other. We need to encourage each other and inspire each other. But we also have to recognize, we are stumbling around. Yeah. And there are going to be periods where it's like we just come home and, it's chocolate and a sitcom after the kids go to bed, and then you crash, right? And that can be okay for a period too.
Yeah. How long is that okay? Because I'm in like year 7 of that, I think.
Yeah. So, 18 is when they're adults.
Oh,
so,
okay. Almost out of the woods.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, scholar, writer, entrepreneur, Dr. Alan Noble, thank you so much for your wisdom and guidance. The book is called You Are Not Your Own. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind Podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.